I know, big surprise. The guy who loves film and music just so happens to like the film about music. But there's something really cool about Fantasia that I want to talk about. Now, it's important to understand that Fantasia was not the first time someone put animation to music. Most early cartoons, the Silly Symphonies, Merry Melodies, Looney Tunes, take your pick, would actually synchronize the action on screen with what was happening in the soundtrack. This became known as Mickey Mousing because it's what Mickey Mouse tended to do. Now, Mickey Mousing gets a really bad rap nowadays. It's considered amateurish in the world of film scoring, and most of the time it really only gets used for comedic purposes. But I think it's because by synchronizing the action on screen to what's happening in the soundtrack, the music can begin to feel like sound effects instead of music to someone who's watching a cartoon instead of listening to the actual soundtrack. But I already talked about how technically sound effects are actually music in another video, so I'm not really going to go into it here. But there's something really cool in the challenges that Fantasia had to face in visually describing the music that they were using, as opposed to someone who might use music to emphasize their own original story. And they kind of outlined this whole idea in the opening of the film.
Now, there are 3 kinds of music on this Fantasia program. First, there's the kind that tells a definite story. Then there's the kind that, while it has no specific plot, does paint a series of more or less definite pictures. Then there's a third kind, music that exists simply for its own sake.
What Deems Taylor is talking about here is the age-old question between absolute music versus program music. Absolute music is music that just exists as music. It is created and exists to be music and nothing more. Program music, on the other hand, is music that calls to some kind of extra musical imagery or narrative. So, for example, if I write a piece of music based off of my favorite poem, say The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and I use music to tell the story instead of words, then that piece of music is a piece of program music because it utilizes something other than just the music. But for a piece of absolute music, you won't get any kind of story or imagery or anything like that. You tend to see really creative titles like Symphony No. 3 or Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Technically, there's a type of music that exists between these two, like we see Taylor describing, but we'll get to that later. Now, why is this important? Well, it kind of describes the origin of what Fantasia is doing. Let me explain. So, once upon a time, there was this guy called Beethoven. He was the best composer who ever lived, and anyone who disagrees with that is wrong, and their mom is ugly. Right around the time after Beethoven's death, the music scene started to change in Europe. For a variety of reasons, people started to critically look at these old composers like Bach, Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. And a lot of academics started to advocate that the music written by these composers were classics and warranted intense study. Soon after that, concert halls filled up with music from dead composers, and the idea of the cultural institution that we now know as classical music began. TLDR, people started fanboying real hard about music written by dead German guys, so now we all have to be really quiet and dress up when we go to the opera. But while this was all going on, a composer by the name of Brahms, who I love, wanted to fight composers like Beethoven on their own terms. Brahms wanted to earn his place next to legendary composers like Beethoven, and he wanted to write music that he believed would be worthy of getting played in a concert alongside those old masters. So he took his sweet time, didn't write as many symphonies as the others, but what he did publish was some of the best work of the time. In fact, he wrote my favorite piece of music ever, which is the third movement to his third symphony. Brahms is remembered as the guy who wrote absolute music because he was trying to compete with these older composers in terms of musical construction. And Brahms did this more or less because of how he interpreted Beethoven's legacy. But on the other side of the spectrum was this guy, Wagner. Wagner was just a terrible human being. He really was. But when he saw Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which was one of Beethoven's last works, it kind of changed him. See, at the end of Beethoven 9, he uses a giant chorus. Symphonies up to this point had explicitly been an instrumental genre. Wagner believed that Beethoven was amazing, and there would be no point in ever trying to write a symphony that would ever compete with him, like what Brahms was trying to do, because in Wagner's mind, Beethoven had already written what was effectively the ultimate instrumental music. So when Beethoven added text to the end of his instrumental work, Wagner thought it was genius. In short, Wagner thought that because you couldn't write music better than Beethoven, you should just add other art forms to your music in order to make it better. And Wagner believed that that was what Beethoven was trying to say by adding words to his symphony. I think he was wrong, and a Nazi, but still very wrong about that sentiment. Nevertheless, Wagner and a sizable collection of composers at this time started using non-musical components in their works. A guy called Liszt, for example, would use texts as inspiration for his symphonies, which he called symphonic poems. So when you hear Liszt's Hamlet, that's him telling the Shakespearean story, but using music instead of words and a stage. Berlioz wrote a 5-movement symphony called Symphonie Fantastique, where the music tells this really weird story of an artist artist who tries to commit suicide because he's in love, but he tries to commit suicide by ODing on opium, but he doesn't take enough to actually be like a lethal dose, so instead he just gets really, really high and has this opium dream about killing his crush and then gets sentenced to death, but then after he dies, he ends up taking a trip to hell or something. I don't know, it's really weird. But Berlioz used a repeated theme, which he called an idée fixe, or fixed idea, to represent the love interest. This was also the first time anyone ever used the dies irae to represent death in a piece of music. But in general, these were the two camps that arose after Beethoven's death, and there's been a big discussion as to who really was Beethoven's successor. Now, the funny thing is that you can find pieces of music by Beethoven that kind of sit in the middle of all this, depending on how you look at it. For example, Beethoven's Sixth Symphony is called Pastoral, so immediately you think of like the countryside, but Beethoven also named each one of the movements with a title that could suggest a picture of what he was trying to communicate. But in the notes for this symphony, Beethoven mentioned that this piece was more of an expression of feeling than painting. So it's sort of a piece of absolute music that you could look at from a program perspective. I've heard people call this characteristic music or descriptive music, but music like this effectively exists in between absolute music and program music. But the interesting thing here is that Wagner kind of became the father of the modern soundtrack. He ended up going off the deep end in terms of adding other art forms to his musical works. He started writing these massive operas where he would write the script, write his own lyrics and the music, and micromanage the costuming and the set and the casting and everything that he could. He believed in something called Gesamtkunstwerk, which means total or like complete artwork, where all the different arts would come together on stage and form the ultimate art form. So by having control over every aspect of his works, he could make sure that they were all working together for the benefit of the final product. And when it came to the music, he used a technique called leitmotif. Now, I'm not sure if I've ever mentioned this on my channel, but a leitmotif is a piece of music that represents a person, place, or thing in a narrative. So when Wagner put these stage works together, he'd use the other art forms to draw attention to what was happening in the music. He used the stage and the drama to create a visual representation of what he was doing in the score in order to emphasize the music, which is exactly what Disney did with Fantasia. Wagner always emphasized the music first, or more specifically, the orchestra. It was pretty common for the time to have the drama take the center stage or write arias that would make your soloist sound amazing, but Wagner valued the fundamental structure of his music over everything else. And when Disney did Fantasia, they basically did the exact same thing. They used a visual medium to emphasize what was happening in the music with one critical difference. When you put a film together, the film typically comes first and the music comes after. This is the fundamental flaw in all soundtracks. You don't have complete control over your work. If you need 2 minutes to develop a musical idea, but the scene only lasts 30 seconds, then you have to change your idea to fit the screen. By having absolute control over the complete work, Wagner was able to change what was happening on stage to fit the music. If the script didn't allow for him to develop a musical idea the way he wanted to, he could just change the script so the music could do what it needed. But film composers don't really have that luxury, so when they write music, they have to be economic with the ideas that they use. So when they write music for a script, it can't really be absolute, otherwise, by definition, they couldn't really have a piece of music that goes with the story of the film. A soundtrack also couldn't really be a standard piece of program music like a symphonic poem, because they still might have to alter their musical ideas or the way the music develops in order to have it fit with what's going on the screen. Listening to a soundtrack from an absolute perspective, although I admit can be fun, in the end of the day is missing the point of what the work of art is, because a soundtrack will have to deal with a different set of goals and limitations than their cousins in the concert hall. In other words, it's unfair to ask if John Williams is as good as Beethoven because they're both doing different things. This, in essence, is why I advocate for the use of leitmotif in soundtracks. Even though you can't have your music come first, if you write a piece of program music and use that to score your film, the direct association between the musical technique and the subject on screen would effectively create a leitmotif. In essence, leitmotif is the process of adhering music to what's happening in the visual medium, which, when you think about it, is what Fantasia did. Where a film normally has the music come in after the film is completed, Fantasia put the music first, and used the visual language of animation to emphasize that music. Regardless of whether the music was an absolute piece that never had anything other than just the music associated with it, or a piece of program music like a symphonic poem, or even something that was somewhere in the middle, the animators had to figure out how they were going to represent the music in their own visual art form, the same way a composer might have to interpret a story in order to write a piece of program music. They had to deal with the limitations of having their animations fit into a pre-existing piece of music, the same way a film composer might have to deal with the limitations of scoring a completed film. They used the visual language of animation to emphasize and direct attention to the music, the same way Wagner did with the visual language of the stage all those years ago. I love Fantasia because Fantasia is to music what a soundtrack is to film. Fantasia is what a soundtrack looks like. This is what a leitmotif looks like. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank all my patrons for making these videos possible, with a very special thank you to Anna Birch, Hayden Elza, Donovan Hodges, Megan Hernscher, AFN Matt, Ethan Rooney, and Clara Tan. If you like what you saw here, be sure to check out my other videos. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch to have your musical questions answered live, and if you really like what I'm doing, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching. So I get that they didn't want to use the original program for The Rite of Spring because it literally ends with someone dancing themselves to death, and that isn't super Disney family friendly. Like, okay, I get it. But Night on Bald Mountain's got some creepy stuff in it too. I think Disney just wanted an excuse to draw volcanoes and dinosaurs.